Hello, everybody. This is Roy from New York Tea Society. Welcome back to another edition of Yi Tian Yi Cha, where we brew one tea each episode and dive deep into it. Today, we're diving deep into Liu Bao Cha. Cha is the category, which means black tea, but it's not the black tea you're thinking of. It's not the Western style black tea. It's the original Chinese style black tea, which in the Western terms we now call dark tea. It's one of my favorite categories, and I believe this is the first dark tea that we do in this series. I'm very excited about it, so I picked a Liubao, which is quite old. This Liubao, I just brought out, this is 6 grams, which I'm going to use here. But let me just show you. This tea is normally packed, in the older days was packed into a big 52 kilogram basket, bamboo basket. And it was stored like this. We're going to go into the whole history, but this Liu Bao that we're drinking now was, you can tell, was big chunks that were cut out of that big basket. And it's an amazing tea, which has mellowed out throughout the ages because it is over 40 years old. I say over 40 years old because the man who I got it from in Ipoh in Malaysia, which is where it's been stored, he has had it for 20 years. The tea was given to him by an older friend who was getting too old to maintain his teas, so he gave his teas away and he gave these to the gentleman that I know. But that person had it for 20 years, also in Ipoh, Malaysia. Before that, we don't know the history of it. So it could be possibly older than 40 years, but I'm just gonna say it's 40-year-old age Malaysian stored Liu Bao. Okay, so let's go ahead and brew it. And normally I use the Gaiwan, but today, because I'm making this old tea, I am going to use this late 1800s teapot, Yixing teapot. I'm not going to go into what Yixing is. I'll just say that today I got this old teapot because I have an old tea and I just felt it was appropriate. Okay, but we're going to do the same thing to it. We got a little stand here, and let's bring Monkey in. He doesn't want to miss out on this, right? There we go. And let's go ahead and do what we normally do when we warm up our teapot. Yixing teapots can hold heat very well, and it's one of the reasons why we would choose it over a Gaiwan. But Yixing clay also can modify the taste of teas for the better or for the worse. So we normally use the Gaiwan when we're tasting tea because porcelain will give you the true taste of the tea, while the Yixing will change it in some way. It could benefit from it. It could also not benefit from it. So once this is warm, let's go ahead and pour that out. Let's get him wet. He wants to play. And we'll pour this out into our fairness pitcher. Because this is such an old pot, you'll see that it might have a little bit of leaking, but it's a handmade in the 1870s, 1870 to 1880s. And back in those days, maybe it wasn't, the lid doesn't fit as tightly as a more modern one, but it's a beautiful pot, and it comes from the Kingston Lambs collection. If you're interested in purchasing teapots that are from Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, send me a DM and we'll get you in contact with him. But anyway, let's go ahead and put this tea in here. I'm going to give that a little shake and then smell it. It is it is earthy, mushroomy, even a little bit of dates in there. Oh, definitely dates, not a little bit, it's dates in there. This is going to be very special. This is the first time I drink it in this pot, by the way, so I'm not really sure what to expect. But I am excited to start brewing it, and then after we start our first brew, we will go ahead and talk about what Liubao is. Okay. So let's go ahead and go right over the top there. Let's make sure it's nice and hot. And we'll just give it a second. We don't need to let this brew too long. And look at how clean that is. Normally, when you think of a 40-year-old tea that's been stored in Malaysia, the first thing that comes to mind is wet stored, foresty. Not always the cleanest tea because it could be a little bit damp and moist and very humid there. But this tea was stored so beautifully. Look at this. Very, very nice. Going to smells like earth tossed with mushrooms. Actually, the chef in me is coming out. Maybe I could make a mushroom gravy out of that. Yeah. And let's go ahead and try this. Oh yeah. If you're a fan of dark teas, this will hit the spot. This is in the aroma, there was more dates coming out, more fruity, but right now it's just more earthy and mushroomy. Very mellow, zero astringency. It's a really good tea. But now let's go ahead and talk about what Liu Bao is. Liu Bao means 6 ports. And it refers to a historical region which is in Wuzhou City in Guangxi province. And there were 6 military administrations in this area. That's why it's called 6 ports or Liubao. And this tea gets its name from that area because where it was made. The history goes back, the first written history we find back in the Qing dynasty. Although it was most likely cultivated much earlier than it was written about. So probably it was around before that. Romantically, people like to say it was around since the Tang dynasty. However, there is no proof of that. There is no evidence at all that it would have been around from the Tang dynasty. Wow, I'm really loving this. I'm sorry, I'm going to be taking a lot of breaks to try this. So, Liu Bao, as I said, it's a dark tea, and the characteristic necessary for a tea to be in the dark tea category is that it has to go through a process called wo dui, which means wet piling, which is when they take the leaves and they pile them up and they wet them and then they cover them in a tarp and they let them compost in itself, right? And it starts to ferment in there. There is micro bacterial changes that are happening, and this is why it's fermentation, not just oxidation alone. So yes, there is oxidation and there is also fermentation. So a dark tea is what we call a post-fermented tea, right? And Liu Bao is just one of many. If we look behind me here, there's quite a few. This is Liu An. Right. This is some bamboo also. This is Tianjin. I'm not gonna bring them all down, but this one is Tianjin, also in the basket. This one here, this big one here, this is Bailian, and that is also one of them. But there are many dark teas. It's a fantastic category of tea, which usually people come around to later in their drinking journey. show pour is probably the most popular of the dark teas, and that is the one that has become popular in the West more than any other. And it is very similar. Some people try to compare Liu Bao with show pour. I do not. I think Liu Bao has its own distinct characteristics. They're both made in a very similar way. In fact, show pour borrowed the piling method of Liu Bao when they first started making pour in the wet piling method to make show pour. Now, Liu Bao was not always wet piled. When you go out to buy Liu Bao today, most likely you're gonna get what we call just a modern style Liu Bao, which is wet piled. But out there is also traditional style Liu Bao with traditional processing. And that's what this is. So what traditional processing was, well, I jumped the gun a little bit. Before we got to traditional processing, we had traditional green tea processing for Liu Bao. And that before the 1800s, it would have been made as a green tea. Very similar to a green tea, very similar to the way pu'er, sheng pu'er is made, where they pick it, they wilt it, they do a kill green stage, a shaching, and then they roll it to break up the juices, and then they dry it, right? So what you end up with is basically a green tea. Now these teas were sent to other places, and Liu Bao was traditionally sent to Southeast Asia. These areas are very humid, and through the traveling through Guangdong and Hong Kong and down into Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, it starts to ferment and change. And then they realized that this taste was actually preferred. So they changed the processing a little bit to adapt to that and to start to make it to meet the demand of what people were requesting. So then the next stage, after the 1800s up to the 1950s, we get into what we call traditional processing, right? And traditional processing is what we are drinking now. That would be this. So this is not a modern style Liu Bao. Traditional processing is you pick it, you wilt it, you roll it, and then you pile it. But you don't pile it. I'm sorry, I skipped a step there. You pick it, you wilt it, you still do the shaching process, you do the kill green, and then you pile the leaves, right? So when you pile the leaves, you're not really fermenting them so much as you are starting off you're initiating the oxidation, and you're initiating the microbacterial activity to start, right? And then they steam this, after drying it, they steam it to get it soft again, and they put it into these baskets and they ship it. But that helped out for it to start the process of fermentation and to speed up the process of fermentation. But it was naturally aged. It was never wet piled. There was no water involved in the piling of it, right? And this happened up until the 50s. During the communist era, the factories, the state-owned factories, they did a lot of research on how to perfect all of this, right? And they came up with the wet piling method. So this is from the 50s to the 70s. Liu Bao starts to be made where they take the leaves, they still pick them, they wilt them, they kill green them, they roll them, they dry them, and then they wet pile them. So now, not only do they pile the leaves, but they start adding the water. And this was a major difference. This was a key difference in the processing. Hold up, I'm talking so much, I forgot to drink this fantastic tea. So it's fair to say that most of the teas, up until the 80s, 90s, you can still find some traditional processed teas, and there are some places that are still making it today, especially by request, because there are a lot of tea enthusiasts that are requesting for it to be made that way. So it can still be found, especially if you go into the areas of Malaysia where they still have some of these old teas stored, that have been stored there since the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? So these teas are usually traditionally stored, and you can tell by the liquid that this is not a modern style. Modern style would be so dark. This one has been aging in the basket naturally, and it is still dark, but you can kind of see through it. So if I had better lighting, you could see. But so modern style Liubao is usually what you will find today, unless you're specifically going out there to look for traditionally processed Liubao. I have several Liubaos on my market, in the New York Tea Society market. This is a traditional style. The other two are semi-traditional style. They're not fermented heavily, because I personally don't like that heavily fermented taste, so I request some that are a little bit lighter in fermentation and still have that shung quality to them. When I say shung, I'm using a pu'er term. So shung means raw, so as opposed to the cooked or the ripe version or the show version. So usually in pu'er you have the show and the shung. The shung is naturally aged and the show is artificially fermented. So in Liubao we don't really use those two terms. We use traditionally processed or modern style processing. Okay, so they also come very, very different taste. If you notice, the three in the New York Tea Society market have three, in quotes, it'll be, one says Yao Aroma. Yao means medicine, and that tea has a very specific medicinal aroma and flavor to it. And the other one I have is called Ginseng Aroma, and the ginseng is a very strong predominant tasting note in that one. This one I just call 40-year aged, because it is more mellow and balanced than the other two. The other two are much more fermented in taste, and this one is just more mellow, balanced, earthy, and mushroom-like, right? But they're all fantastic. There's so much to talk about dark teas, but we're going to, I believe, end it here. Oh, you know what? Let me add one more thing. There were several before. Some people may wonder, was Wei invented for Liubao? There was some piling being done. There was fermentation being done in Heichas earlier. Right? Some examples I can mention would be Anhua Heicha. Right? So they were being piled already, but there was no water being added to the pile. Liuan, which technically to this day probably doesn't have, not piled with water on top of it. They actually take the natural dew from the environment to wet it, and then they let it dry up there and they redo it. But that is piled up, the leaves are piled up on the bamboo, and then the environment itself will ferment it right? So there were forms of piling, and as I said in Liu Bao itself, in Guangxi, they were already piling. They just weren't doing it with water. So Wold Wei, which means wet piling, pretty much began with Liu Bao. Okay, so I am gonna end it there. This is my second brew, and I'm gonna be drinking this probably into tomorrow. And I'll see you tomorrow with another tea after I'm finished with this one, and we'll talk about that. If you are in the area of New York City and you want to visit our tea studio, please come by. We're right in Midtown, in Midtown Manhattan on 32nd Street. And if you are curious about the teas and want to try them, go online to the tea market. We carry a big variety of dark teas and many others. So until tomorrow, when we do another episode of Yi Tian Yi Cha, this is Roy signing out from New York Tea Society.